So I was listening to a recent episode of Sacred Symbols where the question came up over whether we are experiencing a crash in the live service space. This came up as the guys were discussing recent news regarding issues with two upcoming, or supposedly I guess, upcoming live service games. Firstly, there was the reporting that The Last of Us Factions had apparently been put on ice. Some QA testers that were working on the game had been terminated, and a key team member, Anders Howard, the monetization designer, had left the studio after less than a year. Then Sega announced that it was cancelling its upcoming live service game Hyenas. This was supposed to be a sort of extraction type shooter from Creative Assembly. This was particularly surprising as there was actually a beta test for it not that long ago, and it was due to come out at some point before the end of the year, and then it's since come to light that it was actually Sega's most expensive game ever. So yeah, just odd that it was cancelled, but it was cancelled nonetheless. So basically we've got two prospective live service games that have both run into issues in a similar time, and they aren't the only ones. I think I seen literally like 15 minutes before I was recording this that Ubisoft announced they're delaying X-Defiant again, so I guess that's another one you can add to the list. So as alluded to previously, that led to a sort of user submitted question around, are we seeing a crash in the live service space? And the guys had an insightful discussion off the back of this, and it got me thinking about this issue as well. I think to analyse what's happening right now in the live service space, we need only turn to history and look at another genre of game, and that is MMOs. Whilst I appreciate that it was far from the first MMO, in 2004 World of Warcraft launched and took the world by storm. It propelled MMOs into the stratosphere, and the end result was that basically every other company tried to get in on the action and wanted some of that massively multiplayer money pie. So from about 2004 until around 2014-ish, for that 10-year period, everyone and their granny tried to make an MMO. We got things like Age of Conan, Rift, Champions Online, DC Universe Online, Star Wars The Old Republic, Elder Scrolls Online, and even Pirates of the Caribbean Online, which I had never heard of until I was doing some research for this video. Most of these games, and many others, far too many to mention, came to the table hoping to be the fabled WoW killer, the game that would finally dethrone World of Warcraft and take its place and reap the financial benefits that come with that. However, the result was that whilst some of these games found a dedicated fan base of their own, such that they're still around today, like DC Universe Online, Star Wars The Old Republic, Lord of the Rings Online, none of them really, with very rare exception, got anywhere close to World of Warcraft's level of success and ubiquity. Most of these games could broadly be considered as failures. Some games like WildStar and the original iteration of Final Fantasy XIV, being the two big examples, just straight up failed. So this meant that by about 2014, World of Warcraft was still in place as the big dog in the MMO space. A few other games had claimed some sort of significant market share, like Guild Wars 2, Elder Scrolls Online, and the sort of Realm Reborn iteration of Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV in particular has gone from strength to strength as it's released more expansions. But the thing is, most of those games from about 2014 and before are still the top players in the MMO space. Almost 10 years later, nothing has changed. Pretty much every MMO that has launched since about 2014 has had nothing more than a bit of initial hype and then an occasional influx of players maybe when a new expansion released, and that's at best. Most of them just straight up die. Now that is in part because these long-standing big games are actually good and people enjoy playing them, and over the years they have, to varying degrees, somewhat mastered the art of running a live MMO, albeit they have each had their individual highs and lows. Looking at you, Battle for Azeroth. However, it's also because around the time of 2014, having seen all the contenders come and go and fail, developers and publishers started to realise that it just really wasn't worth the risk of actually trying to develop and launch an MMO. So they simply stopped trying. So now what we see in the MMO spaces is maybe a couple of upcoming MMOs that look like they might have some promise, but most of them there's no real clear idea of when they might be coming out or whether they will actually be any good. It's a far cry from, 10 plus years ago where it felt like there was MMOs fucking everywhere. So to tie that back to our central question, I think we are starting to see a similar thing happen in the live service space. I think we're at that sort of 2014-esque inflection point. Like, we have your handful of big live service games like your Fortnites, your Warzones, your Apex Legends, your Destiny 2s, your Overwatches that have been around for a good long while now and are fairly entrenched in terms of taking up a big chunk of market share, not only just in the live service space, but in games as a whole. And we also have a myriad of pretenders who have came and gone and tried to, you know, be the Fortnite killer and failed, like Hyperscape and Gotham Knights and Battleborn and Spellbreak and Marvel's Avengers, Babylon's Fall. Like, there's so many that I would be here all day if I tried to name them all. So now, as I say, with those big games being in place for so long, all those failed attempts to dethrone them, I think publishers and developers are coming to that same realization that MMO developers had in 2014, where they're realizing it's just not worth trying to take players away from Fortnite and Warzone, because the chances are it's probably not going to happen. And that is why we're now seeing things like Factions being put on ice, Hyenas being cancelled, Suicide Squad being delayed after its poor reception, Sony shutting down Deviation Games, Exoprimal being shut out on Game Pass, now XDefiant being delayed as well. I think a lot of companies are seeing games like Babylon's Fall and Avengers and whatever else die and starting to shit themselves, basically, because they're years into developing a live service game that now they don't really know what to do with. The key thing we've obviously yet to see is whether that, similar to the MMO space, will lead to developers and publishers giving up on developing live service games. We're not quite there yet. I think the next year or two will determine whether that's where we'll go or not, because as I say, there is a lot of live service games in production right now. You know, Sony themselves are tripling down on it, and there are many others who are still trying to make it work. So I think how those games go will probably determine which side of the coin we fall down on. You know, if a high percentage of all these in production games, particularly the Sony first party ones, all come and go, I think we will see a similar trend continue as in the MMO space, where people just stop trying. So again, to tie that back to our central question, are we in a live service crash? I guess that probably depends on what your definition of a crash is. You know, all the big established games are still doing perfectly fine. At the time of writing, Fortnite has over 1 million concurrent players and a 24-hour peak of 2 million, so like everything's fine there. But over recent years, we have seen and are likely to continue to see an increased failure rate of new games attempting to enter the space. And I think over time that is likely to lead to a reduction in development of live service games. Again, similar to what we've seen in the MMO space. So if you consider that a crash, then I guess we're in a crash. The interesting question that all this poses is, if we do see that trend come to fruition and we do see a world where people stop making live service games largely, what impact does that actually have on the industry? Could be, for example, that with the success of games like Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom and Hogwarts Legacy, that developers return to trying to make, you know, these big, almost quadruple A blockbuster single player games. And if so, that could be great for gamers, because one thing that has been massively frustrating over recent years is seeing live service elements, you know, crammed into games that they have no business being in. Sometimes games from, you know, franchises that have a history outside of the live service space. You know, like Gotham Knights and Suicide Squad are two successors to the Arkham Dynasty, both with live service elements shoved into them. And whilst I enjoyed Gotham Knights for what it was, I would much rather have had a traditional Arkham game, and Suicide Squad just looks fucking horrendous from what I've seen of it so far. In the MMO space, we had Star Wars The Old Republic, which people were frustrated by because it meant that we weren't getting sequels to KOTOR 1 and 2, but the way BioWare phrased that at the time was, well, this is an MMO, so it's basically, you know, KOTOR 3, 4, 5 and beyond. Yeah, right. So if this trend comes to pass and live service games do go the way of the MMO/Dodo, you know, should this be cause to celebrate? Should we parade the corpses of Marvel's Avengers and Suicide Squad through the streets? I'm not so certain. Whilst predominantly single player games like Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom and Hogwarts Legacy were runaway successes, They're very much the exception to the rule. Games like that are few and far between. Yes, we've had a few of them in the last couple of years, but I think 2023 in particular has been an amazingly standout year for games. So the fact that Hogwarts Legacy and Tears of the Kingdom and Baldur's Gate, for example, all came in the same year is very, very rare. I think games that become cultural phenomenons like those games are rarer than recent times would have you believe, particularly when those games aren't like Grand Theft Auto or something that's already established. Most games aren't so lucky, and at best can only realistically hope to turn over what to a massive publisher is a relatively meagre profit, aligned to the fact that AAA games are obviously becoming much more expensive to make. So my worry is that if live service games do follow the trend of MMOs and die, then rather than seeing a return to, games that we might actually like to see more, what we're actually going to get is either publishers are going to invent some other more insidious way to try and monetize their games, or they might just stop making games entirely if it's just not worth their time. And then what are we going to do? I guess we'll just need to fucking start reading books or some shit.